Well, I'm glad you're back. I'm glad I'm back. Last week, of course, we discussed the Song of Songs, and it was a wisdom conversation, if you remember. And I also said it's possibly a reversal of Genesis 3, in which it's the woman, Lady Wisdom, right, as in Proverbs 1 through 9, who desires you rather than you desiring wisdom. And today we continue again with these more niche books. We're in Lamentations. And our aim is to understand why these books are included in our Bibles. If you like my notes from last time, I believe Bergen already put this up, if I'm correct about that. Now, Lamentations contains 5 poems from an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and exile that followed this. And this flows out of the story of 2 Kings, if you recall, 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25. And to point this out, I throw these scriptures out to most of you, if not all of you have read them, or in order to be able to at least somewhat recall these stories. But there's a lot of gospel talk, and rightly so. But many do not have a deep appreciation for the literature of the Old Testament. They prefer to stick to the surface. And I mentioned this last time as well. That's indicative of our culture. You remember big stories like Adam and Eve and Abraham and Moses and Saul and Solomon, Elijah, Elisha if you're lucky. But now the fall of Jerusalem was the horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point in Lamentations. Remember that God promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings, right? You had Yahweh's presence there in the temple, where the priests maintained rituals of Israel's worship. So after 500 years of all that history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was in ruins, it was gone. Now, the book of Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed that destruction. And these lament poems here that are found here in Lamentations are not unique in the Bible. There's many in the Psalms, and we'll go over this a little bit. There's Psalm 10, 63, 69, 74, 79, so on and so forth. And these poems of lament, they do a number of things. For one, they're a form of protest. They're a way of drawing everybody's attention, including Yahweh's attention, to the horrible things that have happened in the world that should not be tolerated. They're a way of processing emotions as well. So in these poems, Yahweh's people vent to their anger and their disappointment and their frustration. And the ruin caused by people's sins and selfishness. And this is not an exhaustive list. But finally, these poems are a place to voice confusion. And we'll see that especially in the 5th chapter. Now this is interesting, and I might have a lot to say on this later on, but suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises. And none of this is actually looked down on in the Bible. It's just the opposite. And these are not my words, but it has been said that these poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. These human words of grief that are addressed to God now have become a part of God's word to his people. I mean, have you thought about that before? Because I haven't. That these words of lament that are addressed to God are now a part of God's message. Now to the design, and to this we will absolutely be coming back to, but for the sake of some background, chapters 1 through 4 are what are known as acrostic. And maybe you see it in your Bibles, which just means literally alphabet poems. Each poem, verse, or even stanza, and this should be apparent in some of y'all's translation, it has, NET even has the Hebrew letters in parentheses and sort of subtitles over each stanza. But the Hebrew alphabet is made up of 22 letters, and the poem discovers that through each of these chapters. When I ask why this might be, the usual answer is memorization. These are alphabetical for the purpose of memorization. Remember last week I mentioned that Jews would memorize the whole Old Testament, at least their version, the Tanakh. T for Torah, the first 5 books, and then Nevi'im for prophets, and then Ketuvim for writings, the stuff that they throw at the back, I guess. But again, much of my purpose is to seek out what this book does, and not so much as what it says, although that's how we arrived at this conclusion. But I see it going deeper than just purely memorization. The book's order is ordered and in a linear structure. It's a contrast to the disorder and the pain of a confused grief that's explored in these poems. It's as if Israel's suffering is explored A to Z and trying to express something that's inexpressible ultimately. Now, chapters 1 and 2 each have one verse per letter, but the themes that are discussed are different. Chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. The author, or the poet if you'd like, here personifies Jerusalem as a widow, also called the daughter of Zion. And she sits alone, she's bereaved of her loved one, she's devastated, and no one comes to comfort her in chapter 1. And it's a powerful metaphor. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on Yahweh to notice her fate, and in this image, the poet, he is showing that the city's destruction brought a level of psychological distress on the Israelites that can only be expressed within the experience of a funeral or death of a loved one. Now, as a church father, Tertullian, maybe you've heard this name, who asks this famous question. He says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, right? But rather we should ask here, what has Israel to do with Jerusalem? Think of what Jerusalem meant to the Israelites, and that's the picture. Now that it's destroyed, it's gone, it's laid flat, right? Now, chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and how it was brought about by the wrath of Yahweh. I'm sure not fond of discussing that word, in all honesty. And the reason for that is one of my good friends, he almost obsesses over it, and so does his whole tradition. There are many notions of that word, the wrath of God, right? But remember, unlike tradition, which we went well over last week, here I'm using the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, to interpret what's being said here. I'm having a biblical discussion about the Bible, not inserting the Christian or the Jewish interpretations that have existed throughout history. That's no dig to my friend, but it kind of is, because his tradition is indicative of what pattern of thought that he likes most, and we're all guilty of that in some way. But in here, wrath is a key word in this poem, though. It's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous and volatile anger. And to be fair to my friend's position, he doesn't believe that. But the biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice, ultimately. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with Yahweh, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. Whenever they erected the golden calf, for instance, they did that, of course, but they attributed that to Yahweh. It was even found recently in an archaeological dig that many of them would wear eyes of Horus because they were coming out of Egypt, right? So some of them, early on at least, were polytheistic, but they would attribute it to Yahweh, that eye. Even stamps of letters, I believe, which had other nations' symbols on it that they would send out, they would also attribute that image to Yahweh as well.
I thought the calf was attributed to Baal worship. The calf, the golden calf, I thought that was attributed to Baal worship. When he represented by a bull or something.
Yes, but how the Israelites saw it. At that time they were polytheistic though, right? So whenever they made it, they thought they were doing something good for the strongest God, so they attributed it to what would be their God. You're right though, in other nations they would absolutely see this and say, well, they're worshiping Baal. That's right. And so yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil. He will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. So this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified. But this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. All of that by itself would be a good study on the very character of God too. The phrase that I constantly hear is God allows evil to happen. I cannot seem to escape that phrase in my circles. That would be a good place to look in the Old Testament, but anyhow.
You're supposed to learn from it though.
What's that?
Like all the stuff he puts you through, you're supposed to learn from it.
Absolutely. Let's see, we'll go over Job just a little bit. Whenever he says, Lord giveth, Lord taketh, whatever the case may be, what is the next line in Job? I think it's chapter 3. It says, blessed be the Lord, regardless, right? And then chapter 3 breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter. We'll get to all this. So it's the longest poem in the book, chapter 3. And the voice is that of a lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole people. And what's interesting is that this chapter is full of language that's drawn from other parts of the Old Testament, from the lament of Job, like I just said in chapter 3 of Job, from other laments in the Psalms like 22 and 69, and even from the suffering servant poems in Isaiah 53. This poet sees hardship as a form of God's justice, just like chapter 2 said, but paradoxically, this is what gives the poet hope here in chapter 3. And it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. And again, I'll be discussing structure later, but just keep that before you. Because of Yahweh's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They're new every morning. How great is your faithfulness? You recognize that? Oh God, so I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will put my hope in him. That's chapter 3, verse 22 through 24. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise to not allow evil to get the final word. I'll be the first to admit that there are places in the text where I just appeal to mystery, but once you open up the picture, people have to do that in every area of their life at a certain point. So there's no logical fallacy in me saying that, certainly here. And it's no impact on my faith, given what we do know. Most younger people I come across have issues with that sort of thing, appealing to mystery. And many throw out that phrase, God works in mysterious ways. That seems like another conversation that can be brought out of this. But for this poet, regardless of that, for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed for the hope of the future, right? And now onto chapter 4, it goes back to the structure that chapters 1 and 2 do. And it's a vivid and disturbing picture of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem. And it contrasts how things used to be in the Jerusalem of the past and how terrible they became. So children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meals, and now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. And the royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And now the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away, right? So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts. It's exploring the depth of suffering that Israel has brought on itself. Now the final poem, like I've hinted at already, is unique because it breaks that design pattern. It's the same length as all the other alphabetical poems, 1, 2, and 4, but the alphabet order is gone. It's as if the poet cannot hold it together anymore, and his grief has just exploded back into chaos. The poem is a communal prayer for Yahweh's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering or abandon them, and the poem offers a long list of all different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask Yahweh not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others as well, giving voice to their pain even. Suffering in silence is not just a virtue in this book, if you've noticed. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but voice their protest, to vent their feelings, and to pour it just all out before God. So now the book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstance makes them feel like God is nowhere to be found at the same time. And so the final words of the book, this is chapter 5, verse 22, if you'd like to look. The final words of the book just leave this tension just totally unresolved. It asks, unless you've totally rejected us, and then it just sort of trails off, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, much like our own experiences of suffering and pain. Now, the story of the Bible does not end there. But this very important book shows us how to lament and prayer and how grief are a part of the journey of faith, of God's people in a broken world. And that's what Lamentations is about. So as we examine this often avoided book, we'll see, if you've not already seen, the shocking space that it creates for the dark things that need to be grieved. It's definitely not a book that you look forward to getting into. And there are not a whole lot of sermons being preached on Lamentations either.
I don't
It's
know
dark
about
and
anybody else,
foreboding.
like, I like being sad because, like, after all of that's said and done, like, it lets you realize what's worth it in life and what's good in life. You know what I mean? Like all the sweeter things and all the joys that you did have before. You appreciate them more after all that.
It might be hard to communicate that on a Sunday morning if people are expecting sort of the same all, because having a space, it's I don't want to mischaracterize it. I'll just say that Lamentations provides that space, though, and that's the purpose of the book. So you're speaking to that, but I don't know. I feel like a preacher would be hard pressed to sort of create that within 25 minutes or something like
We
that.
always get the good news, though.
That's
They
true.
don't tell you all the stuff that comes with it.
That's true.
Like it says, you're supposed to suffer. You know what I mean? You're gonna lose things. You're gonna lose people. You're gonna lose relationships, especially like
For sure.
over religion. You know what I mean? And like Jesus even said, like, I'm here to cause families to fight. Mother against daughter, father against son. Brother against brother. It's gonna be like that. You know what I mean? So like when you lose all that, you still have your faith. So you should be glad in that at least.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Or he says, "I came to create division."
Yeah.
Right. He also says another thing which is interesting, this would be another topic whenever he says to jump for joy in Luke chapter 6 at your sufferings. But seems like
I'm always glad for it.
different,
I
right?
thank him for it, because without all that, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't be as strong as I am. I wouldn't be as smart as I am. I wouldn't have gone through all those things.
Oh, sure.
Had all that experience that I had, going through it. But like, there is like a point to where like you're done with it. Like you can't keep dwelling on it, because then like if you're obsessed with being sad or I used to be a terrible alcoholic, but like I was always stuck in it. You know what I mean? With alcoholism and being in love with my sadness, like it burns on idolatry. You know what I mean? I was worshiping those things and not the Lord at those points in my life. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I'm glad you spoke up about that. But instead of talking about, I think we discussed last time talking about different levels of meaning. There are different levels of meaning to the book of Lamentations. We talk about the sexual imagery as well as the imagery of wisdom in the Song of Songs. But here it really is, and to your point, here it really is just a deep lament. It's dark and it's foreboding, and we're going to look at something that's quite frankly disgusting. But now, what kind of prophet are we talking about? We're in the Babylonian prophets here in Lamentations while this is being written. Tradition says that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, the weeping prophet. It makes sense. I'm not sure there's much credence to the tradition, but tradition credits him with authorship. I don't think academia does. However, reading Lamentations will truly make you weep if you sit with it. So now just to review, just briefly, the prophets up until this point, they're what are called the pre-Assyrian prophets. We have Amos and Hosea, their images. Amos was the plumb line and the ripe fruit, if you recall from reading the minor prophets. In Hosea, he married a prostitute. And now Judah, the prophets for pre-Assyria, we have Micah and Isaiah with the images of a judge and a vineyard, respectively. And after pre-Assyrian, we have what are called Assyrian. We had 4 prophets, 2 to Israel. We had Jonah with the picture of potential, right? And Nahum with the picture of what's called din, retributive justice, the pronouncement of incoming judgment. And then there was Zephaniah. That was the image of, and Dale uses this on Sundays usually, whenever he says teshuv, to repent, to return and repent. It's called teshuvah. That's a playground for preachers, that word. So maybe you'll recall some of those names and some of those events pop into your mind. Now we get to the Babylonian prophets where we sit. Now we come to Jeremiah. His image, of course, is weeping. One of the things that we might get into is how Lamentations actually works in literature, in the biblical literature. You have these 2 different voices. These 2 voices that are in conversation, actually similar to Song of Songs in a way, where you had the beloved and the groom, and they went back and forth to each other. This one isn't nearly as pretty. And it's poetry. It's very dark, but you have 2 voices. One is the voice of the narrator, and one is the voice of the woman who represents Judah and the people of God. The bride, maybe as you think of Jeremiah, who talked about the people as a bride. So you have this bride, and you have this narrator. The narrator opens and starts here in Lamentations chapter 1, verse 1, with the opening verses. And again, narrator's voice. You have an observer who's just looking out over Jerusalem, which has been destroyed. God's people are in ruins, and the narrator speaks. Lamentations 1:1 says, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she who wants to be great among the nation. She who is queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress." So here's the voice of the narrator who just looks out and just opens Lamentations with just a bleak, grim observation of what has happened. Then a few verses later, towards the end of verse 9, all of a sudden things change. We're no longer listening to the narrator, but we're listening to the voice of the woman. There she says, "Look, O Lord," and you can hear the voice change. "Look, O Lord, on my affliction, for my enemy has triumphed. The enemy laid hands on all her treasures." And then she sighed, and then we're back to the narrator's voice again. At the end of verse 11, she says, "Look, O Lord, and consider, for I am despised." So her voice is really prevalent as you get into chapter 2. All of a sudden, she gets to have this larger monologue. Now I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 2. Let's see, chapter 2, verse 20, where it starts out, "Look, O Lord, and consider whom you have ever treated like this. Should women eat their offspring, the children they have cared for? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young men and maidens have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered them without pity. As you summoned to a feast day, so you summoned against me terrors on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. Those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed." So her voice comes in and she just says, is this right? There's some dark, screwed up stuff here. People eating their children. Has that showed up before, or is this the first? Do you guys recall where else in Scripture this has been mentioned?
They usually do it whenever like there's a war and they like have sieges where they just sit there and wait them out. And like when they run out of food, like I think there was one part where it's like, we'll eat my kid today if we can eat your kid tomorrow.
Do you recall where in the text?
No, not exactly.
I'm kind of fishing for answers. I'm sorry.
Yeah, like I know it said that.
Right. Deuteronomy 28 had these. This is what Lamentations is referencing. If you recall, there's a passage that says, in essence, if you do what's right, good things will happen to you. But if you do what's wrong, here are these curses. This is Deuteronomy 28, starting in verse 53. "You will then eat your own offspring, the flesh of the sons and daughters the Lord your God has given you, because of the severity of the siege by which your enemies will constrict you." Again, to your point. "The man among you who is by nature tender and sensitive will turn against his brother, his beloved wife, and his remaining children. He will withhold from all of them his children's flesh that he is eating, since there's nothing else left, because of the severity of the siege by which your enemy will constrict you in your villages. Likewise, the most tender and delicate of your women, who would never think of even putting the sole of her foot on the ground because of her daintiness," that's what my Bible says, "will turn against her beloved husband, her sons and daughters, and will secretly eat her afterbirth and her newborn children, since she has nothing else, because of the severity of the siege by which your enemy will constrict you in your villages." And then it goes on. The curse of covenant termination here in verse 58. "If you refuse to obey all the words of the law, the things written in this scroll, and refuse to fear the glorious and awesome name of the Lord your God, then the Lord will increase your punishments and those of your descendants, great and long-lasting afflictions and severe, enduring illness. He will infect you." Anyways, when you see this in Lamentations, it's really a reference. It's a poetic reference to what God said in Deuteronomy. The author of Lamentations is saying, all that you said, all that stuff that you said would come true, it's now coming true. All the stuff that you warned about, we didn't heed the warning, and now we're experiencing it. At this point in the book, the woman is crying out saying, is this right? Honestly, you're going to sit by and let this stuff happen? Now, before we move on, I just want to make a point about the lament. Like I said, not too many sermons on this are being prepared to exegete passages from Lamentations. And yet I find it interesting to know that the Bible makes spaces for this kind of emotion. It's just unique. There are what are called imprecatory psalms. Psalms in the Bible. Imprecatory simply means containing a prayer for evil to befall someone or to invoke judgment or calamity or curses upon them. But the Bible doesn't seem to waste time creating spaces for all the people to connect with the presence of God. This is not a book referencing the Bible or even Lamentations specifically that refuses to speak to those who mourn. The Bible is not a book that demands you to get your act together and put a smile on your face first. There is space for a lament. Again, it's okay. Part of the reason that the Bible has a book of Lamentations, part of the reason that we do read those imprecatory psalms, and part of the reason that we have these passages is because the Bible knows that we have to be able to call out and recognize the darkness that's inside us ultimately. Because if we don't process it in appropriate ways, if there's not something to do with the grief, if there's not something to do with the lament, you can't go nowhere with it, right? It's going to find an outlet eventually. Now, there are healthy responses to the lament, of course. There are healthy things to do with your anger and your rage and your grief. There are healthy ways and unhealthy ways. There are healthy ways, and however, we often don't find good ways of creating that sort of space. And this is one of the reasons that I appreciate art so much. This is just a general conversation. And why I have a really hard time drawing these hard lines between, you can't engage in this art, you can only listen to Christian music, you can't watch these kinds of movies, because art has a way. Obviously, there are appropriate things to engage at different levels of age development, that's without saying, and I'm not arguing for just anarchy when it comes to our consumption of the media, of course. I even have a very respected Church of Christ man figure in my life who taught my father, who said, he would go to R-rated movies, take his kids, and he would say, well, there are worse things in the Bible, and he meant well. He's one of those figures who is simply an upright man. I truly mean that. But art has a way of giving us expression to get rid of. It's part of the reason why Christian music, for some of us, is such a joy to listen to, but you just have these moments where you say, I cannot listen to one more prayer song. If I hear, Christian music doesn't sell, quite literally, if they make darker, more honest music. What you're forced to do is find these other outlets, at least what I've found.
Punk rock, death metal. That's what I like.
Well, it depends. But this is why some of us are drawn, and I don't want to start throwing labels around, like Christian and secular, but some of us are drawn to more secular perspective. You pop in a CD and there's something inside of you, and you wrestle with all this guilt and shame, and as that favorite album of yours, you put it in and you just breathe a sigh of relief because you say, oh yes, because that expression of the frustration, the anger, and the rage and all that. Now obviously, again, this goes without saying, there are healthy ways to express that, healthy ways to do it, but it's really good to pause here in Lamentations and go, this is another place where the people of God are finding a space to just rage, and they're raging at the appropriate place ultimately. They're not raging irreverently. They're not raging in a way that disrespects and dishonors Yahweh, but they are raging at Yahweh. I hope you can see the difference there. Letting him have the emotion because God can deal with it, right? He can accept it. It's an Ecclesiastes thing. There's a time for this. You're not going to live here forever. There's an appropriate time and place for these emotions. There's that cliche line. There's a time. There's a season for all things. But really, just to get a touch personal here, whenever people ask me how I'm doing, if they ever ask me truly, I always just sort of spit back the human condition. I'm terrible and I'm wonderful and blessed all at the same time. So it's not really much of a season. But good will also do, just saying I'm good. But now, since I'm a little bit more academically wired, we'll close the book with a bit more academic observations. There's a few more things going on in Lamentations. So as I said before, Lamentations is called an alphabet acrostic. What that means is every line, and you don't see it in the English because it's not written in the English. It doesn't work that way in the English alphabet, but in the Hebrew. And I brought my Hebrew text if any of y'all would like to see that. Every verse, or every stanza rather, we would say the letter A, and in the Hebrew it's Aleph. 2 would be letter B, and we'd say Beit, and then 3 Gimel, and then 4 Dalet. It goes all the way down alphabetically through the Hebrew alphabet. And again, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are no vowels. People put vowel markings in later, so people like me can learn that sort of thing. You'll notice how many verses there are in chapter 1. There are 22 verses, as I said earlier. Now, if you notice in chapter 3, there are 66 verses because there are three of each, right? Aleph, 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 Beit, 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 Gimel, 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 Dalet, Dalet, right? It's triplicate. Then it goes back to chapter 4 and chapter 5 verses, to 22 verses, it goes Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, right? So it's an alphabet acrostic, but if you're paying close attention to the numbers, 22, 22, 66, 22, 22, what strikes you about that sequence of chapters, of those 5 chapters?
9, 3, 6, 9. Like
How so?
22, 44. Yeah, 66.
I don't think I'm tracking.
No. I don't know, maybe
36 nines.
ain't there.
If we have the first 2 chapters are 22 verses long, and then the third chapter is 33, and then the last 2 are 22, what does that say? What does that point to?
The third chapter has 33, I thought you said.
66, I apologize.
It's
Did I say
66,
33?
okay.
I apologize.
Well, then
Still
it
more.
would make it where every third one started with a letter of the alphabet. That would get you the
Right.
same 22.
What does that say to you? I guess is what I'm trying to ask. What does that tell you that there's 3 instead of 2?
Is it so
And this is
that
for
there's-
anybody.
Is it so there's 7 alphabet groupings throughout the whole book?
You're thinking too hard about it.
Okay.
It seems, I know. Well, it seems mirrored. It seems mirrored. You have an A thing going on here. 22. It's saying pay attention to 66. Why is this different? And it's really beautifully designed. It's not trying to hide this at all. You can see it. Lamentations is absolutely direct. If you're reading this at all, you immediately pick up on the nature of what's called a chiasm. And often many will call it an alphabet chiastic acrostic, and they, those scholars, and I like it because it's ACA. It's a chiasm within itself. Now, I don't believe I discussed this last time, but this is a narrative structure. So maybe you've heard of something called the mark and sandwich before. In my Luke class, I went over a 9-chapter long chiasm. So this deals with structure. The name chiasm is also interesting because it's the chi sound, the key really, but the fraternities at LCU say chi. It's the letter X, the first letter of Christos in the Greek, right? Christ. But there's a narrative function in here too, and for whatever reason, here in Lamentations, it seems to be most appropriate. So what strikes you about this? Here I have, suppose I look it up. You finish this to make Christ. It all points to the center, essentially. Here's the first part of the Here's the first part of the chiasm, and if you finish it, it makes that X. That's why I have these. And you can see it's mirrored. A, B obviously correspond to B prime and C prime. Pointing to the center, quite literally, this has the most verses. It's wanting you to look there. And here I just have, this is acrostic. Same thing here, it's alphabetical order. It's acrostic, but in 3s, acrostic. And then remember, he just kind of falls off.
And I got all the rabbis were writing mathematicians, so I was written that way.
Somewhat. Sometimes studying numbers is difficult. It's hard sometimes. But all chiasms point to the center for the most part. I mentioned those mark and sandwiches, so sometimes they can have an outward reflecting sort of commentary. The middle, if it was just ABA for instance, the middle would reflect on the 2 outside ones. But here in Lamentations, it's all pointing towards C. So now let's start in chapter 3, verse 19. There's no light in Lamentations for the first 2 chapters. As I've said, the very first part of chapter 3, it says, this is how bad it is, this is how bad it is, this is how bad it is. Then a shift starts to happen, and we begin to work towards the center. So now in chapter 3, verse 19, it starts out, I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast with me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. All of a sudden, there's a shift happening. I remember all this stuff, but I remember something else, and I have hope. It's a weird thing to have in the middle of a book, though. Keep going on in verse 22. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning, great is your faithfulness. I said this at the beginning. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. So in the midst of all this lament, the tone is changing quite a bit. It's good for a man to sit here in this space, and your reaction might be, for 2 chapters I've been reading about all this horrible stuff, and then as soon as we get to the closer to the middle, we're getting sort of reflective. No, maybe we should just stop and realize it's good to wait on the salvation of the Lord. But you might still be saying, what's going on here? So now in verse 28, let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. What does that remind you all of?
Job.
New Testament. Do you guys recall? It says, let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. Right. It's evoking that, not in the Hebrew Bible, but Jesus is evoking that imagery whenever the gospel writers decide to include that. They're including Lamentations in that. Okay, so now the author says, let him sit alone in silence. Let him bury his face in the dust. Let's just stop for a moment, the author says. Let's just sit in a space, wait for the salvation of the Lord. Let us consider something. And now we come to the middle of Lamentations, so keep going. Verse 31. For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone. To crush underfoot all prisoners in the land, to deny people their rights before the Most High, to deprive them of justice. Would not the Lord see such things? That was the center of the whole book, the entire book. The center of this chiasm and C is listening. God doesn't cast people off forever. He doesn't just do this because he willingly enjoys it. He does it because people are being crushed underfoot, right? There's this theme of injustice again. He does this because he rises up against injustice. He's going to rise up against this injustice would be the implication. The implication here is we're lamenting, we're creating all this space for our grief. We're lamenting, but let's stop and think about it because we know who God is, and we know that we're going to be rescued eventually because we always have hope. I love to stop here and talk about the hardening of the heart with Pharaoh or in Romans and how that's not a permanent condition, but also that consequences exist at the same time. But for time's sake, let's keep going on. Verse 37. Who can speak and have it happen if the Lord has not decreed it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both calamities and good things come? Why should the living complain when punished for their sins? Let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord. So now the author says, why should any living man complain when he's punished for his sins? All of a sudden now, it's not just about our rescue, but the author is saying, the author shifted and said, let's sit here and reflect, think about who God is, and take hope. Now on the backside of hope, let's start thinking about our own sins and how we've actually been to blame for this. Let us examine our own ways and test them, and then let us return to the Lord. Again, there's that word shuv, it comes back in. But keep going, verse 41. Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God in heaven and say, we have sinned and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have covered yourself with anger and pursued us. You have slain without pity. You have covered yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can get through. You have made a scum and refuse among the nations. Now all of a sudden, the book goes back down along the backside of the chiasm. It goes back into darkness, right? Right in the middle is this treasure of how to deal with it. First of all, you can just read the book of Lamentations and appreciate the fact that it gives you space for your lament and your grief and your darkness, and it gives you space for that. If you keep reading, if you're going to keep reading it, eventually this book is going to start to do a work in you, and all of a sudden you recognize this chiasm and what it's saying. Now all of a sudden, this same book that was giving you space and time for your grief. The same book is speaking to you about moving on from your grief, turning your grief into something that's redemptive and productive. This book starts to do a work. Again, I spoke about Beatitudes, not the Beatitudes, but a Beatitude. And this text, again, is a Beatitude, essentially. All that means is it does what it says, right? Jesus, in the Sermon on the Plain, didn't say, let us all be poor in spirit. Let's all of us be poor in spirit. Come on now, on the count of three, poor in right? The text says, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, right? It does what it says. And you can come out of this book back into your grief, but with a newfound perspective about why your grief may be here in the first place. I'm not suggesting that everybody's grief is a result of their sin. It is all about the point of the author of Lamentations is how you look at that destruction, right? In this particular instance, in this piece of historical context, the author is saying, I think there's something here we need to think about. The good news is that God doesn't cast us off forever. The good news is that his rescue and redemption is coming. The good news is that there's always hope in the midst of the lament. In Lamentations, quite literally, there's hope right in the middle of the lament. And that's our discussion on Lamentations. However, remember how the book ends again. This is chapter 5, verse 22. It ends with something of a paradox where the poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstances make them feel like God is nowhere to be found. And so the final words of the book leaves this tension totally unresolved. It says, unless you've totally rejected us, and then it goes on and just kind of trails off, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, again, much like our own experiences in pain, right? Now I'd like to shift, just lastly, to Babylon and this picture that we're presented with. And if we have time at the end, I do have a reading. As I've said before, this is the year 587 BC. The city of Jerusalem, it was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. Remember, a year later, in the city, and the city and the temple were then burned. Thousands of Israelites were taken from their homes and relocated all over ancient Babylon, and they became exiles, right? So now they're a minority, surrounded by a new culture with new gods. Some Israelites chose to resist Babylon by revolting or withdrawing. Others gave in, adopting the Babylonian way of life and accepting these gods as their own. And you might think that those are your only two options, right? Especially if you're put in their position. But the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. He said to settle in, to build houses, to plant gardens, to grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon and to pray to the Lord on its behalf. So this is seemingly a third way, isn't it? It isn't a compromise or a revolt, but what does it look like, right? And there's actually a whole book on the Bible that explores that question. It's the story of Daniel. Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into the Babylonian exile. Because Daniel had royal heritage and education, he was recruited along with some of his friends to work in the high court of Babylon. But work for the enemy, right? Wouldn't that be compromise, or could they just gain the king's trust and take him down from the inside? That's what you might expect, right? But instead they take Jeremiah's advice and choose the third way that is actually present. They serve the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and clothing and style and eating habits, so they seek Babylon's well-being. But by doing so, aren't they just giving up their heritage then? That's what it seems like. But actually they're not. As you're reading on, the story focuses on those moments where they draw the line. They choose faithfulness to their God and resist the influence of Babylon. So for example, when they were commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as if he is a god, they won't go that far, apparently. That's what the text says. This is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, its injustice. But they do it non-violently by laying down their lives. So God vindicates Daniel and his friends for their faithfulness. So they would serve Babylon, seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God. This is what Jeremiah was envisioning. The way of the exile is a combination of loyalty and also subversion. So they're still exiles. But Daniel and his friends, he longs to go home. They long to go home. In fact, Daniel believed that God was going to send out a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace. Y'all probably recall where that's come up multiple times in Scripture as well. But when did he think this ruler would come? At first he thought it was within his lifetime, but then he had a dream where he found out after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, and then another, and then another, and then another. So Babylon did fall, and Israel did not get back home, but now they're ruled by Babylon's successors instead. So they maintained the mindset of an exile, right? They're waiting for their true home to come to them instead. They continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that was being thrown at them, that came along. This now leads us to the time of Jesus, and I'm not talking about the history of interpretation here. The empire of his day was Rome, as you all are well aware, ruled by Caesar. Some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave and adopted Roman culture and adopted their gods as well. But watch Jesus carry on the subversive loyalty of Daniel all of a sudden. Like when he said, it's fine to pay taxes to Caesar, give him back his coins. But then he said, do not mistake Caesar for God. Maybe you recall that. God is the one who deserves your total life and allegiance. So the way of Jesus is the same mix of loyalty and subversion, it turns out. He taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he also got arrested for speaking out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem and Rome. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and it cost him his life ultimately. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations, the king that Daniel hoped for, right? And here, again, I'm discussing Lamentations within the confines of the Hebrew Bible. But regardless, Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail. So until then, his followers are living in a type of exile, essentially. This is why Peter calls followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles, if you remember. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place he happened to live, to honor and to love all people. But then he reminds them that this is not their true home. They're still living in Babylon, though. Well, they're not living in Babylon. Babylon doesn't exist anymore, though, right? Or does it? Right? In the Bible, Babylon has now become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinitions of good and evil, ultimately. So we all live and work in Babylon, right? The question ultimately stemming from Lamentations then becomes, how do I seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater? And it's precisely that. Jesus' followers are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. That is, and I mean this literally, the way of the exile. The way meaning Jesus, and exile meaning our condition. That's the way of our exile. I hoped we got to this point. I do have here a reading from a gentleman named G.K. Chesterton. He's a poet and theologian who kind of ran loose. And this is more about Job, but I think it's indicative of what's happening in Lamentations. He has a lot of good things to say. But I'll start out, and he is talking about Job, but hear this. He says, the central idea of the great part of the Old Testament may be called the idea of the loneliness of God, which is an interesting idea. God is not the only chief character in the Old Testament. God is properly the only character in the Old Testament. Compared with his clearness of purpose, all the other wills are heavy and automatic like those of animals. Compared with his actuality, all the sons of flesh are shadows. And again the note is struck, as Isaiah 40:14, where it says, with whom hath he taken counsel? I think here he's taken from the Luther Bible, believe it or not. But so he says that the Old Testament hero is no more supposed to be of the same nature as God than a saw or a hammer is supposed to be of the same shape as a carpenter. So hopefully there you can see some allusions to Lamentations. He goes on, there are indeed those scriptures, innumerable instances of the sort of rugged humor, keen emotion, and powerful individuality, which is never wanting in great poetry. So he nailed poetics right there, the science of literature. He also says that God means more and that he knows more than us. But to Job, and I think it's I'm still putting this together in my mind, but I think it's apparent in Lamentations whenever he says the book is so intent upon asserting the personality of God that it almost asserts the impersonality of man, unless this gigantic cosmic brain has conceived a thing. That thing is insecure and void, right? What are we? That's the next question that stems from that. God asked Job, eventually in the end, he says, who are you? And Job realizes he doesn't